Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning. People came from near and far. We still have some folks still coming from far away. It's wonderful to see so many people who are in the same field of citizenship education, people both from Ohio and people from around the country. My name is Lee Strang, and I'm the director of the Chase Center. And I'm going to describe a little bit about the Chase Center, describe our symposium, and do a few words of thanks. The Chase Center, like many of the centers here, we have 22 represented from around Ohio, addresses two, in my view, related concerns. First, many Americans appear to lack essential knowledge of our common civic tradition. And second, we Americans appear to have lost the capacity to discuss and debate with our fellow citizens in a civil and productive manner. Together, these have led to a worrisome polarization in the broader American culture and a precipitous drop in trust in higher ed by Americans more generally. The Chase Center in particular responds to these challenges through its teaching, research, and public programming that tries to focus on the common civic tradition, the things that Americans hold in common, and also to try and provide opportunities for the discernment and learning about the skills that people in a pluralistic republic need to be able to live well together. Today's symposium has three complementary goals. First, it provides an opportunity for the 22 Ohio Civic Centers to gather, share fellowship, and get to know each other and learn from each other's experiences. Second, the symposium puts the leaders of Ohio centers into conversation with thought leaders in the field on university-level education. Third, the symposium will be a catalyst for the 22 of us, this is my fingers crossed, collaborating into the future. So my hope is that we'll have a lot of conversations in the sessions, outside the sessions, and then out of those conversations will come collaborations between centers, among centers, and maybe of all the different centers throughout the state. So please view today's symposium as a conversation among colleagues. And so as the moderator signals, please feel free to chime in and share your thoughts, even if they're tentative thoughts, because we're here to learn from each other today. Thematically, the day has two halves. The morning will be focused on the politics or potential partisanship of civics, and the afternoon focused on the curricula of civics education in higher ed. There are competing visions of what civics is and should be, and this is a chance to learn together through our conversation. Before we get in our first panel, I just want to thank our symposium co-sponsors and supporters. So from Ohio State, the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability is a co-sponsor. The Center for Ethics and Human Values has been a valuable partner as well. And we also appreciate the generous support of the Jack Miller Center, which, as many of you know, is the leading nonpartisan supporter of civics education in the United States. And we also want to thank the Stanton Foundation, whose mission is to create a more informed citizenry by supporting innovations in civics, including conversations like this. So please join me in giving all of those a round of applause. And now to our first panel on the politics in citizenship education, or the politics of citizenship education, moderated by Jeremy Fortier, our assistant director. And I'd like to give Jeremy a round of applause as well for all of his work. It's an extraordinary conversation, and Jeremy is the architect of that. So Jeremy, please kick us off.
Thanks very much. I want to mostly keep a sort of light hand as a moderator and mostly, as Lee suggested, have a kind of conversation, hopefully amongst colleagues. I will give a kind of formal introduction to everyone and then just say a little bit about the questions and rationale for the particular panel. So just as a formality, first we'll say, just going through an alphabetical order, Susan McWilliams Barndt is professor of politics at Pomona College. Dan DiSalvo is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the City College of New York. Peter Levine is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And Verlan Lewis is Sterling Professor of Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. The guiding questions for the panel on the program state, to what extent should civic education aspire to get students beyond partisanship? And how are the politics of civics education shaped by institutional context? And just a little bit on the rationale for those questions. The first question about getting beyond partisanship or not really occurred to me because Peter and Verlan at different institutions and kind of doing civics from different angles have both separately published work suggesting that left and right are not helpful frameworks for making sense of political disagreement. They come at that from different angles, different methodologies, but they kind of separately did work on to that effect. Verlan's book, The Myth of Left and Right, Peter's recent article, people are not points in space in critical review are kind of making that point from different angles. And so I wanted to kind of tease out this question of, is that the point of civics, to get beyond left-right frameworks? It might not be, but that's one possibility. One aspect of that issue, though, and this I think came up in Peter's article on people are not points in space, one thing that's cool about that article, he has a little experiment about how student debate is conducted at Tufts, his home institution, versus Kansas State. Right? And there's some interesting differences at Tufts versus Kansas State. And so partly for that reason, you could say Dan represents the Harvard of the proletariat in the City College of New York. Sue McWilliams represents one of the kind of leafiest liberal arts colleges in Pomona College. But they're also people who have just thought deeply about civic education and liberal education more generally. So it's always good to hear from them. So that's kind of the rationale or constellation of issues. But again, I don't want it to be super formal in terms of how we approach it. That's just kind of all in the background here, and I thought it was a chance to start a conversation on some of those topics. So in this case, uniquely, we'll go out of alphabetical order. I think for the most part, alphabetical is simplest, but because that kind of convergence between what Verlan and Peter had recently published was at top of mind, we'll have Verlan and Peter, and then we'll have Sue and Dan speak as well. Again, the idea for these roundtables is a little more prepared remarks. I'll leave it up to folks. If they want to use the podium, they're free to come over here to use the podium. If they're more comfortable sitting, they can stay over there. And yeah, we'll start with Verlan. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's just a pleasure to be here, surrounded by many friends and people whose work I admire. Just want to start by thanking Jeremy and Lee and the Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society for the great work that they are doing and for organizing this symposium. I believe we live in a moment in American history when a lack of civic virtue in our society, culture, and government is threatening to transform our constitutional republic into a different kind of regime. And I believe we need now more than ever academic centers like this that can promote an understanding of the thought and practices critical to the perpetuation of our constitutional order. This kind of civic education is particularly important, of course, in a republic. As Montesquieu wrote in The Spirit of the Laws, it is in republican government that the full power of education is needed. Fear in despotic governments arises of itself from threats and chastisements. Honor in monarchies is favored by the passions and favors them in turn. But political virtue is a renunciation of oneself, which is always a very painful thing. This republican virtue, requiring a continuous preference of the public interest over one's own, produces all the individual virtues. Therefore, Montesquieu says, in a republic, everything depends upon establishing political virtue, and education should attend to inspiring it. Now, I believe this virtue referred to by Montesquieu can take a couple different forms. First, it involves preferring the public interest over one's own self-interest. A citizen with this kind of virtue might, for example, volunteer to serve in the American military, even at great personal risk to their own safety and security, because of their love for their homeland. On the mundane level of policy, a senior citizen with political virtue might favor deficit-saving entitlement reforms, even if it means they themselves would receive smaller Social Security checks from the national government. There are lots of ways that citizens of the United States must put the public interest ahead of their own self-interest in order for our republic to survive a foreign attack or the impending crisis of federal debt. And while we certainly always need more of this kind of virtue, there are many admirable examples with this first kind of political virtue in our country today. However, it is the lack of the second kind of political virtue, which is more germane to this panel, that I want to talk about today. This political virtue is preferring the public interest over one's own group interest. Every student of the American founding knows about this problem. It was identified by Madison in the Federalist as the problem of faction. But few people today have useful suggestions about how we could overcome this problem. Fortunately for us, I believe the problem was not only identified by Madison, but the answer to it is also given to us by him, and his teaching needs to be central to our work as civic educators in America today. So, as Jeremy said, a guiding question for this panel is to what extent should civic education aspire to get students beyond partisanship? And if we define partisanship as the tendency to be partial to our own party and our own party's interest at the expense of the public interest, then it would seem that getting beyond partisanship could be a necessary element of a proper civic education. After all, what Madison wrote in Federalist 10 to describe the United States in November of 1787 seems just as accurate in describing our situation today in April of 2025. Quote, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority." Now, of all the problems facing America that Washington could have addressed in his farewell address, he focused on this same problem identified by Madison. He said, quote, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able and more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." So America's founders identified majority faction and demagoguery as two of the greatest dangers to Republican government, and I believe they remain so today. So is the answer to this question simply that we need to educate students to be nonpartisan? Actually, I argue today, no. While Madison and Washington both warned about the dangers of factionalism, they also recognized that political parties are inevitable. As Madison explained, the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. So Washington argued that party spirit is a fire not to be quenched, but instead demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. So rather than asking whether the civic education should get students beyond partisanship, I want to discuss today how civic education can prevent party spirit from bursting into a flame that consumes our republic. As Russell Muirhead has put it, what our politics needs is not less partisanship, but better partisanship. Thus, we must distinguish between healthy partisanship that is a bulwark of liberal democracy and unhealthy partisanship that corrodes it. According to Madison, the key is not to get rid of parties, but to ensure that party conflict is characterized by pluralism rather than monism. So following Madison, my answer to this question is that civic education should teach students about the truth and goodness of pluralism, in contrast to the folly and danger of monism. Let me explain what I mean by those terms. Pluralism is the true understanding of our political situation, characterized by a plurality of individuals, associations, groups, all pursuing the public interest and their own self-interest in a heterogeneous society. Given the variety of social life and the diversity of individual reasoning faculties, life experiences, each person we encounter in a pluralistic society is a human being of equal moral worth, with which we will agree on some political issues and disagree on others. Pluralist party politics is the way that diverse peoples join heterogeneous party coalitions to pursue a few common ends that they find most important at any given time. Yes, the desire for recognition, our thumos, will cause us to take pride in our preferred political party, but a pluralist understanding of the world will also temper that pride. It will allow us to see that our party, while certainly better than the alternative, is not correct about everything. Likewise, the other party is not wrong about everything. Such an understanding will allow us to recognize that our co-partisans are each wrong about a variety of different issues, and leave us open to the possibility that we ourselves are wrong about some political issues. Pluralism promotes intellectual humility. It causes us to recognize that the other party has some positions that we prefer to our own party's positions, and it leads us to search for common ground with people who do not share our party affiliation. We can even accept the outcome of a free and fair election when our party loses, because we recognize that the other party will implement some good policies, even if not as many as if our party had won. This is what I define as healthy partisanship that is conducive to the preservation of constitutional government and liberal democracy. I want to contrast that with monism, which I argue is a distortion of our political situation, which falsely believes that politics is just about one thing. The monist delusion might recognize the truth that there are many smaller issues in politics, but persists in believing that all of the hundreds of issues in politics flow out of the one big issue position. In the monist worldview, every individual, association, and group can be placed in only one of two camps: those who are correct about everything because they got the one big issue correct, and those who are wrong about everything because they got the one big issue wrong. The monist worldview was effectively expressed by Robespierre during the French Revolution when he said, quote, "There are only two parties in France, the people and its enemies. We must exterminate those miserable villains who are eternally conspiring against the rights of man. We must exterminate all our enemies." Madison, who I believe is the antidote to Robespierre, saw pluralism in a large republic as the solution to the factional warfare endemic to monist small republics. In Federalist 10, he famously wrote, quote, "The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens." Unquote. So when each individual recognizes that each of the groups with which they identify are always a minority group in a large pluralistic society, then they will be more interested in constitutional restraints on government power. They will have an incentive to uphold the separation of powers, federalism, individual rights, and the rule of law, because they know that political power will only ever be wielded by other groups or a broad party coalition that they have joined with other disparate groups. However, when citizens see themselves as belonging to one of just two groups in society, they are tempted to unleash government power whenever their majority faction controls it. This leads to a ratchet effect of increasing government power and a race to the bottom for individual liberty, where two alternating groups constantly undermine constitutional restraints in an effort to once and finally dominate and destroy their opponents. So to quote Washington once again, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, gradually inclines the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual on the ruins of public liberty." Now you might be thinking to yourself, no one in the US today is a monist. That worldview went the way of the Jacobins. Sadly, I argue the intellectual framework invented by the French Revolution is still with us today. The left-right spectrum, which was invented in France, is the most widespread and dominant way of thinking and talking about politics in the Western world. And every time we use the language of left-wing and right-wing, or progressive and conservative, we are implying, whether we consciously recognize it or not, that politics is just about one thing. After all, a unidimensional left-right spectrum can, by definition, only measure one thing. If instead we mean to recognize the truth that there are many issues in politics, then we must use a different and older vocabulary and language to describe that reality. The American founders did not use the left-right intellectual framework. It was imported into America by journalists and university professors in the 1920s and 30s. As this monist way of thinking and talking about politics has become more entrenched in recent decades, I believe our political discourse has become increasingly impoverished, angry, and shrill. The left-right spectrum tells us a lie that the constantly shifting issue positions of the Democratic and Republican parties are philosophically connected by only one of two possible political ideologies, progressivism and conservatism. In this way of thinking, the Republican Party is in favor of tax cuts, opposed to entitlement reform, in favor of abortion restrictions, opposed to aid in Ukraine, in favor of protective tariffs, and opposed to environmental regulation because it is a right-wing political party, and conservatism somehow binds together all of those issue positions. Likewise, the Democratic Party is opposed to tax cuts, in favor of gun regulation, opposed to free speech on college campuses, in favor of aid to Ukraine, opposed to tariffs, and in favor of environmental regulation because it is a left-wing party with a philosophy that somehow binds together all those issue positions. This kind of monist thinking causes Democrats and Republicans to believe that all of their party's issue positions are, as a matter of logical necessity, correct, while all the other parties' issue positions are incorrect. Never mind that each party is constantly swapping issue positions with the other party. A pluralist recognition of the truth of the constantly shifting baskets of issue positions held by both of our major parties would encourage American citizens to recognize that while their preferred political party is currently better than the alternative, it is not entirely good, nor is the other party entirely bad. The recognition of this pluralist truth promotes intellectual humility, openness to political deliberation, and a respect for limited government. Monism, on the other hand, lends itself to an unhealthy kind of partisanship, identified by Russ Muirhead as one that, quote, does not merely reflect divisions already there, but creates divisions. This kind of party spirit can threaten the unity of the political community. The fewer values and goals rival partisans share, and the less trust they have in each other, the more the common good becomes unintelligible. If the division goes deep enough, it becomes impossible to deliberate together. Justice becomes little more than a grand name of the interests and goals of particular groups, unquote. So it is my argument that thinking and talking about politics in terms of a monist left-right political spectrum is not only misleading by implying that politics is just about one thing, but also harmful because it incentivizes the kind of unhealthy partisanship just described. So in conclusion, pluralist political parties are good for democracy as they allow citizens to connect with their regime in a healthy and constitutional way that reminds them of the importance of limited government, individual rights, and the rule of law. Monist parties, on the other hand, tend to undermine democracy as they encourage citizens to call for authoritarianism rather than constitutional limits on government power. So civic education should not necessarily aspire to get students beyond partisanship, which is ultimately impossible, but should instead get students to practice healthy partisanship by teaching them the truth of pluralism and the folly of monism. Our Madisonian republic depends on it.
Peter, it's up to you. Yeah, all good.
Thanks, Jeremy, for having me and everyone for being here, and I'm looking forward to the whole day's conversation. And that was kind of, in a way, a remarkable experience because I so strongly agree with Verlan on everything that I kind of want to say. What he said, and go sit back down and just listen to the conversation. But I'll try. I'll throw away a bit of. I mean, I'm glad for the overlap. I also hope other people challenge both of us. But I'll try to adjust a little to complement what he said. So one point So I guess my comments are sort of a set of additions around your structure. So one point I'd make is that if we define partisanship as actual participation with a party, and we think of parties as pluralist, and traditional parties were pluralists at least because they had local, state, and federal pieces to them, then I would say partisanship, for the same reasons you said, is actually a good thing. It's also extremely rare, because the point I would add is that the parties are empty shells as actual institutions, right? There's very little engagement with the actual party. So just to illustrate, and I think this is a pretty representative illustration, but my state of Massachusetts is a Democratic state. Overwhelmingly, the Democratic Party of the organization of the state of Massachusetts has 6 employees, and an absolute maximum had a $7 million budget in a presidential year. And so what the parties are, in fact, is a set of entrepreneurial individual candidates and campaigns which label themselves with the party and are very little controlled by the party. Just as an example, Elizabeth Warren just finished a non-competitive senatorial re-election campaign with really no problem at all, but she spent $28 million just herself, 4 times more than the party. And she would have had, if you looked at young people's participation, overwhelmingly they participate with campaigns to the extent that about 3% participate in electoral politics, but they're participating with campaigns and candidates, not with parties. Insofar as parties are labels, then they do, for the reasons Verlan said, interfere with civic culture in several ways. I just want to itemize the ways that I had in mind. One is the potentially hostile attitudes that they foster towards the other side. So a point Verlan made. So let's call that affective polarization. And one way to measure that was the American National Election Study asks everyone to rate the 2 major parties' members, just people in the other party, in that party, on a scale from 0 to 10. So you're rating your own party, other party, lots of people are independents anyway. And let's say that rating the other party at a 0 means you're affectively polarized. So if you're a Democrat and you rate the Republicans at 0, you're affectively polarized. When that question started in 1978, very few people did that, 5 to 8% of Democrats and Republicans. But if you look at the curve for both parties, it's up and it's symmetrically up, so that now about half of people are affectively polarized, saying that the other party is at 0, which I think just makes it hard to co-organize a republic. By the way, it's not, this is partly a conference about civic education, and so one has to bear in mind that it's not particularly the young who are affectively polarized. In fact, it's the other way. So the most affectively polarized people are older and Republicans, so that an outright majority of Republicans over 50 rate Democrats at 0, whereas both young Democrats and Republicans are less so. And they're the same at 38%, which is a lot, though. But it means that if the problem is affective partisanship, the solution can't just be school and college education. The second point is that partisan labels can interfere with our ability to think through the separate issues. This is exactly, it's funny because I had the same list pretty much that you had, Verlan, of how our issues, we pull the issues together. I mean, I get it partly from your work, but I actually had Ukraine, vaccination, tariffs, abortion, and immigration, but you had a related list. So the point being that those could be put together in different ways, and a partisan label interferes with your thinking about how to put them together. One piece of research, one line of research says that, well, people get their cues from party leaders, so we put together the things we believe because of the party leaders. That, I think that's empirically probably true, or at least it's very plausible. Is that bad? It wouldn't be if you imagine a kind of an appropriate division of labor where we have some professionals and very thoughtful people who think through all these issues and pull together packages, and then everybody else who's kind of busy takes their cues. But you have to have a lot of trust in the party leaderships of the two parties to be thinking in a public-spirited way and to be smart about it instead of being jockeying for position, and I would say they're jockeying for position. The third point is the point that we very much have in common, which is the idea that the party label, the way it works in a country like the United States, but in a lot of other countries too, does connect to the notion of an ideological spectrum, which goes back to the seating arrangements in the French Revolutionary Congress, the idea that there's a left and a right, and this interferes with our thinking. It's just a metaphor, first of all. The idea of a party, of a ideological spectrum is just a metaphor. That means that the idea of polarization is just a metaphor, because polarization is, means you've moved apart across some kind of a line. Just to shake that metaphor, I do have a different one. I also think it's only a model, it's not the truth. But in this alternative model, each of us has a bunch of things we believe. And we also can connect at least some of the things we believe to each other. So I'm for the Ukrainian cause because I'm against authoritarianism. So I'm saying the because means I've connected two things. So each person has some degree of a network of beliefs and their connections, and also a human network with other people who influence them. And so I've been mapping these with in different contexts. And one finding, I think it's a finding, is that people who could be assumed to hold the same ideological view actually have highly heterogeneous networks. And they tend to overlap. So in the study, I wasn't actually going to mention it, but I'm so glad you did. In the study comparing Tufts and Kansas State students, their networks, the Tufts students are to the left of the Kansas State students in terms of which way they would vote, but their networks actually overlap a great deal as they talk about the same topic. So it's miseducation, broadly speaking, to tell people that they have that they fall somewhere on the left-right spectrum. The last point is also related to Verlan. I'm doing kind of footnotes, but he pointed out the framers' ambivalence towards parties, which is well known, but I like some of your quotes, which I hadn't heard before or forgotten. In particular, so there's the problem of faction in general. That's better dealt with if we have many pluralistic factions. So the problem of two big parties, two big partisan labels, is pretty grave from the point of view of the founders. First of all, we teach students, especially K-12, I've worked for 30 years on K-12 civic education policy and research, and in a lot of K-12 civics, the framework is the Constitution, right? That's sort of the scripture of the civic religion, so that's what students are taught, and so parties come in mostly just under the First Amendment as an association, right? There's a right to have a party. But that underplays drastically the significance of particularly the two-party system in the actual Constitution of the United States. And its problematic place. So probably a lot of people know Owen Lintz's 1990 finding, or claim anyway, that really no presidential republic in the world except the United States had survived. Everyone had turned to authoritarianism. And the reason was because of partisanship. It's because whenever you have a separately elected executive and legislature, and they're from the different parties, they're going to start to fight, and the fight is going to be brutal and bring one or the other down. Either the executive's going to fail or the executive's going to go authoritarian. So why then would we have, because he wrote that in 1990, why would the American Republic have more or less survived other than the Civil War so long? And an answer would be because we didn't have exactly the party system, because we had a white supremacist Southern Democrats, liberal Northern Democrats, liberal Republicans, and conservative Republicans. So presidents were in the position of basically a prime minister is able to produce majority coalitions in the Congress, regardless of which party they were. So nobody was, or very rarely, sometimes, but very rarely were presidents just at odds with Congress, with a majority in Congress. But that changes really around the Clinton era, when the parties separate into two big blocks just in terms of their likelihood to vote the same way. And what we may have seen since then is the Lindsayan nightmare playing out, right? We've had 94% of the time that the government has been shut down due to 94% of the days in which the government has been shut down due to a budget impasse has been since Clinton. Three out of the 4 presidential impeachments have happened since then, but also those impeachments have had no effect on the person impeached, right? So this is examples of impasse. And the rate of use of executive orders is rising, actual legislation falling to the point where I argued that really in the 21st century there's been no major landmark legislation, either conservative or liberal, passed. Right now this president has signed more executive orders, but also signed fewer laws than any other president in the first 100 days. So you could see the Lindsayan nightmare playing out, and then I would just challenge us to think, as I yield this floor, whether we're miseducating students, because the standard idea would be the Constitution's brilliantly set up. By the way, it allows people to have parties, so we have parties, and it's sort of, everything's considered sort of stable and as planned. But if we're undergoing a 25-year accelerating Lindsayan nightmare, then that's a miseducation. Thank you.
Civics education is an ambitious, if not daunting, task. One that I think reaches far beyond what we commonly understand as the stuff of civics classes: how a bill becomes a law, what are the differences between political parties, why we have a separation of powers, and so on. I take my bearings here from Aristotle, who argued that this kind of training, that is the training that we so often call civics education today, is actually a civics education of the most superficial sort. Even though he called politics the architectonic science, Aristotle did not think that the study of politics was at the heart of civics education. In fact, Aristotle barely mentions the study of politics, or the study of history, or the study of law in Book 8 of the Politics, when he lays out his vision of civics education. Rather, Aristotle argues that civics education requires attention to 4 subjects we rarely think of in terms of civics education today. 1, music, which teaches people to appreciate and create states of harmony with those who have different voices. 2, sports, which teaches courage, teamwork, strength, the importance of abiding rules in competition, and grace in losing. 3, drawing, which teaches careful observation and attention to form. And 4, writing, which teaches literacy, communication, and promise-keeping. In that curriculum, one that invariably surprises and delights my students, Aristotle draws attention to the fact that the best education in civics has 2 qualities. First, it does not just aim at teaching a subject. It aims at teaching people, at imbuing them with the habits of the heart and mind that best enable them to live well and govern in concert with others. Statecraft, as Aristotle understood it, is at bottom soulcraft. Civics education is thus at bottom a form of moral education, one that tends to the great qualities of soul that animate great citizenship. Any curriculum that focuses too narrowly on the technical forms and ordinary rules of political order, that usual civics class stuff, is thus a curriculum that neglects the central character of civics education properly understood. Now, of course, to say that you're involved in soulcraft or moral education is tricky at the best of times and certainly unfashionable in our own. That's why, second, Aristotle's vision of civics education reminds us that the best curricula, like the best teachers, instruct through indirection. I always think on this point of the great educational model of my youth, Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid, who taught, as I hope you all know, Daniel-san karate by seeming to teach him about everything other than karate. But why indirection? Why not just teach civic virtue by talking to students about civic virtues? Why instead teach civic virtue by encouraging kids to sing in a choir? Why not just teach Daniel-san karate by teaching him karate? Why instead teach Daniel-san karate by teaching him to wax on, wax off? If Taylor Swift were here, she'd say something like, "We're the problem, it's us." That's a joke for the 14-year-old girls in this audience. We human beings are fiddly creatures by nature, and our dignity requires us to quarrel with being taught. Those of you who are parents or have been parents to teenagers will know that the worst way to get a teenager to do something is to tell her to do it. The teenager regards such instruction as an affront to her honor. Do you not trust the teenager? Do you not trust that the teenager already knows what she needs to do? Do you not believe that the teenager knows she has to do her homework? Do you think that the teenager is a baby? Do you think that the teenager is stupid? You might as well save yourself time and slam the teenager's bedroom door in your own face before you open your mouth. Our students are teenagers. Mark Twain, I think, understood this better than anyone. You can think of how Huck Finn chafes at the attempts of the widow Douglas to civilize him. The teacher, Twain wrote in his private notes, must not professedly teach and must not professedly preach, but, Twain said, the teacher must do both if his lesson is to live forever. Civics education, that is, must not always look like civics education, and it must not always announce itself as civics education. Indirection is especially important when it comes to political education at colleges and universities, since all of our students, in addition to being teenagers, arrive on campus thinking that they already know something about politics, whether it's what they've heard from their parents or their peers or Joe Rogan or TikTok or whatever. Our students arrive on campus already fluent in the categories and labels of conventional political life. Most of them, if addressed with what they take to be a political argument, immediately attempt to interpret that argument, whatever it is, in terms of familiar categories and labels. As many of you know, if you teach political science, the first thing your students do is to try to label you. Are you a liberal or are you a conservative? Where do you stand on the political spectrum? And once they've got you labeled, of course, they don't need to listen to you anymore because they already know what you think. And they already know what you're going to say, or they know what they think about what you think. You become predictable to them. And as soon as students, like anyone, think they can predict what they're going to hear, they stop listening. Students come to college, that is, already armed to the teeth, and civics education requires disarming them. But we won't disarm them simply by proclaiming, "Lay down your arms." We can only disarm them, as all great humorists and teachers do, with cunning, with misdirection, and with careful, painstaking attention to setup and circumstance. Now, I'm coming to you today, as Jeremy mentioned, from a small liberal arts college, one of a rapidly declining number of such colleges, dedicated in word and principle to the idea that there are certain arts of liberty, liberal arts at which our educational endeavors should aim. Part of why I think such colleges are special and why I've dedicated most of my life to them is that even as they are subject, as we are all, to the corruptions of the age, these colleges still show the vestiges of their origins in the early republic and the relative attentions of the early republic to civics education. Many of the things that may seem quaint about such colleges, our small scale, our residential character, our focus on books, our relative deprioritization of academic majors, our insistence on sitting around tables and talking face to face, our amateurish sports teams, are precisely what have lent such schools outsized civic influence. Consider, while small liberal arts college graduates make up less than 2% of our nation's college-educated population, small liberal arts college graduates are disproportionately represented in positions of civic leadership. Did you know, for instance, that 20% of US presidents attended small liberal arts college? I'm filled with SLAC facts, small liberal arts college facts like that one. The founders of the nation's small liberal arts college, notably several of them signers of the Declaration like Benjamin Franklin and George Walton, or signers of the Constitution like Benjamin Rush, took seriously what Aristotle and others taught them about civics education, that such education has to tend to the whole person, body and soul, and have an expansive sense of curriculum that transcends disciplinary boundaries inside the classroom and provides a very intentional experience outside the classroom. This includes a suspicion of scaling up, despite our present-day culture's fondness for it. One of the best things I've ever heard a graduating senior say is that by the time you leave Pomona College, you can look around at a room of your classmates and think, I know something about everyone here that they do not know that I know. Of course, that also means that the converse is true. The graduating Pomona senior can also look around her classmates and think, everyone here knows something about me that I do not know that they know. That is discomforting in some sense, but it's the mark of being in a small and personal society where you know your actions matter to other people. American society, by contrast, is large and impersonal. You all know, because Verlan just reminded you, that in Federalist 10, James Madison argued that America under the Constitution would be all about extending the sphere, expanding the scale of political association to an unprecedented degree in human history. Madison argued, of course, that bigger republics are safer because their scale makes them more resistant to malicious faction. It's probably true. Of course, for that kind of safety, we Americans pay a cost in terms of our ordinary civic lives. We Americans live on terms of massive scale and speed, terms that do not encourage civic participation or encourage us to believe that our actions matter to others. In a society as vast as the United States, I'm very fond of Nathaniel Hawthorne's formulation that America is a country too vast by far to be ever contained within a single human heart. It's hard to feel that you matter as a citizen or that civics matters to you at all. American political scientists, as many of you know, are always trying to find some truth to the teaching of MTV's Rock the Vote, the notion that every vote counts. But in most of our studies, we prove all over again that as a matter of statistics, each vote doesn't count very much, if not at all. You'd be better off, spending that extra hour making some money at work. But we know that no democratic republic can survive if each individual within it focuses on those kinds of numbers, saying, in effect, well, I'm only one of 350 million people, so screw it, I'm going to stay at home and look for stuff to buy on eBay. How do we produce good citizens in a mass and impersonal republic, a republic that valorizes popular sovereignty in theory, but renders it elusive, if not impossible, in practice? The answer offered by the educational leaders of the early republic, the answer is still discernible, if deteriorating, in our nation's small liberal arts colleges, these colleges that the former president of Reed, Steve Koblich, calls our most distinctively American institutions, is to provide students in college with countercultural living conditions on campus, especially in terms of scale. Such colleges make it impossible for students to avoid each other, or to avoid talking to each other, or to avoid talking to professors. Such colleges make students live with each other, make them eat with each other, give them the opportunity and responsibility to start clubs, join clubs, sit on hiring committees, bring in speakers. We let them throw parties, we throw parties for them. We have them play music, play sports, draw pictures, and read books. We take their work seriously. The aim is to make it impossible for them to avoid the conclusion that they and their actions matter to other people. Part of the idea is that after graduating, when such students go out into a big and often bad world, they will refuse to give up on acting as if they and their actions matter. Once you have the experience of mattering to other people, it's not something you readily give up. It's the kind of soulcraft that undergirds statecraft, captured in G.K. Chesterton's adage that no man should endeavor to be anything more than a citizen, and no man should endure to be anything less. This gathering represents the moment of great promise embodied in our nation's new civics institutes and centers. In this moment, I hope we will have great ambition that goes far beyond thinking in terms of conventional political labels and categories, and far beyond the relatively superficial attention to classroom content that constitutes most of what gets called civics education today. I encourage the many of you who are here in positions of influence in these centers to think big in two ways. First, to think about the really, truly big scope of what constitutes civics education properly understood. And second, to take seriously the challenge about how the big scale of this republic poses special challenges for and impediments to civics education. In saying this, I follow Aristotle and the educational visionaries of the early republic, in hoping that we remember that civics isn't just about teaching a subject, it's about teaching people. People who, as we all do, need to be cajoled to see past conventional categories, need to be called to their higher selves, and need to be convinced with great care to care for the common good. Thank you.
Well, I first just want to start by thanking Lee and Jeremy for inviting me to participate on this august panel, and with so many other all of you in this really terrific conference today. Jeremy introduced me by mentioning City College's perhaps aspirational connection to Harvard as the Harvard of the proletariat. But given Harvard's recent performance and current circumstances, I wonder whether we should sever the tie. But I'll come back to that. So clearly, higher education, you could say, has been the latest casualty of America's partisan divide. And there's no need to rehearse all the events and things that have led up to that current situation. But the takeaway is, conservatives view higher ed as out of step with American values, and progressives see it as insufficiently radical to drive change. Civic education or civic learning has recently emerged as perhaps the royal road out of this impasse. But fresh thinking about civic education and higher education has only just begun, and you could say this conference is therefore dedicated to that important task. But my argument, I don't know that I have a lot new to say that hasn't already been said by the panel, but I do want to maybe say it in a different key and maybe push back on a couple of points. My argument is that civic education and higher education is or should be directly tied to partisanship. That's the way it can address party polarization. Party polarization has obviously been slow in developing, as Peter suggested, and it's going to take a long time to unwind, or perhaps at least be moderated to a sufficient degree that it doesn't threaten the political system as a whole. So civic education has this huge task of, at least in a small way, trying to address party polarization and shore up American liberal democracy. That is, connecting civics to partisanship in, as Verlan said, the right way, can help shield universities from partisan attacks and perhaps improve our public debate. My core contention is that self-government in the United States really depends on a healthy partisan competition and alternation, peaceful alternation in power. Right? But that itself requires a rough or broad consensus on foundational principles and values, as well as constitutional procedures or rules of the game. And really, that's the challenge or the trick. And in some sense, the country needs to relearn how to agree to disagree. And that's because, in some sense, democracy, understood as self-government, really depends on party competition. And the benefit of political parties is to offer the electorate alternative interpretations of the common good in the form of competing policy packages among which voters are invited to choose. So self-government is really, in one way, really is the choice among competing parties, right? And that's what led this old political scientist that people have forgotten about, E. Schatzsnyder, to say democracy is unthinkable save in terms of political parties. And that the people are semi-sovereign, Schatzsnyder said, because really they don't vote directly on laws, but just for competing parties. So party competition, though, here's the rub, requires a prior agreed-upon framework of norms and values for civil disagreement, right, and peaceful alternation in powers. That is to say, a shared political culture. Otherwise, one party or the other is going to see the opposition party as illegitimate and try to wipe it off the political map entirely. So how to get that, you could say, spirit of the loyal opposition, that sense that the opposition party isn't legitimate, is hard to instill. So the task of civic education is to get us to see where we can agree and then where we can disagree. That is, you could say the civics is prior to the partisanship, which is this distinction that some have made between civic versus partisan. So civics needs to train citizens to be, quote-unquote, civil in a particular way that involves the recognition and mutual respect of differences of opinion and interest, as well as basic constitutional principles, right? Only then can democracy really be sustained and function. But I should say 2 points here, and here's the controversy, is that this conception of civics is controversial, you could say, from the point of view of a purely procedural democracy, right? The Madisonian system alone. Doesn't matter who makes it up, the system will run and somehow arrive at agreement on controversial issues, right? And that is civic education means some sort of, as Sue mentioned, some sort of soulcraft. And this is because liberal democracy is predicated on, you could say, normative foundations that through its own mechanisms it can't justify, which is to say it can't be neutral on its own foundational principles. So civics has to start with those foundational principles on which we have to get some sort of agreement. And so the controversy, and this will really be the task for some of the panels, I think, in the afternoon of deciding these curricular questions, is how to separate civics from partisanship so that we can be better partisans in the future, right? And that's going to be the tough trick or the task. And then where should all this be instantiated? And this is the second question that Jeremy proposed to the group. I enjoyed very much Sue's ringing defense of a liberal arts education. I went to a liberal arts college. But I've been a long time in the urban trenches at a large public university. And here I think that civic education is rightly suited to large public universities, right? And that should be the focus of philanthropists, of legislators, of faculty and elsewhere. And I'll just make my 3 arguments in favor of that proposition. The first is you just reach a lot more students. These are much larger. Look, we're here at Ohio State University. It's gigantic. So in part to play this large civic function, you just reach a lot more people than just thinking about the Ivies, Ivy Plus, the small liberal arts college of New England and the few in California. So one is just a matter of scale. Right? If part of the issue here is to reach a broader group, to slowly chip away at the unhealthy dimensions of our current partisan divides, we need to reach more people. And the way to do that is through big public universities. The second is that public universities also tend to be much more diverse on a whole range of socioeconomic dimensions. Now, City College, where I teach, is arguably the most diverse institution of higher education in the whole United States, if not in the world. And interestingly here, it's socioeconomically diverse, it's racially and ethnically diverse, it's very religiously diverse, and that means there just aren't uniform views, and the views of students don't fit into the political taxonomies of our national debate. That is, the students find it very hard to, when they come to my class, in some ways the opposite of what Sue described as the students arriving at Pomona. They don't have prior views. Their a priori political views our preferences are very weak and muted and often conflictual, and they don't understand them. And that, in my opinion, makes them much more open to civic education than students who are coming with a lot of a priori views. Just to give one example of this, I teach a large Intro to American Government course with about 200 students in it, and I ask the students in the beginning, I say, how many of you, it's mostly freshmen, can identify your parents' party ID in American politics? Maybe half, usually about 40%, right? Which is to say 60% have not set themselves up on the left-right political spectrum, Democrats or Republicans. Because it's City College, I also say, well, how many of you, with a large first generation and immigrant student population, how many of you can identify your parents' party ID in another country? About 30%. So they can say in the Dominican Republic or in Colombia or Mexico what their parents' party ID is, but they don't know about where it is in the United States. And I think that that diversity of views just lends itself better to this task of civic education. We're more likely to make headway on this separation of civics and partisanship so that they can then be tied back together in big public universities than elsewhere. And lastly, third, I think there's a lot of evidence that aside from some very rarefied places of political, cultural, and economic leadership, say in New York and elsewhere, the graduates of public universities are really where civic leadership is occurring. If you look at who are governors, who are state legislators, who are state judges, those are more political roles, are almost all, or not all, but a very large majority come from public university graduates, right? So if you look at here in Ohio, if you look in states like North Carolina, who is really the civic leadership are people that graduated from public universities. Even true in New York, if you look at the head of the state legislature, both the state House and the state Senate, all are CUNY alums, right? Much of the city council, same thing, right? So if we want to chip away at this, really building up from the bottom to chip away at some of the problematic aspects of our current party polarization, I think the place to start is public universities. I'll leave it there.
So let me ask first if people want to respond to each other on the panel, and then anyone who wants to chime in can. We'll try to send a mic around, but I just want to Ben.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask.
I was supposed to ask for a mic to go around.
So,
Apologize.
So I went to a great public university, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I taught at a great private liberal arts college, Furman University, for 17 years. And I want to hear, and so Dan and Susan have just made competing claims about which of these kinds of institutions are more crucial to public life. And I wonder if Susan has anything to say in response to Dan's claim on behalf of the public university.
Well, I think we did. Can this mic go on somehow?
you're good.
Okay. I think we did a good job doing what Jeremy asked us to do, which is to talk about how different institutional contexts matter in terms of civic education. I would think in terms of these civic centers, there's a lot to learn from small liberal arts colleges and a lot to learn from big public universities. I do note, though, that one of the things that they oddly have in common is in very different ways. They're rooted in an identity that's like not a national identity, right? They somehow like shrink the scale, right? You're not going to find many CUNY graduates like governing in Sacramento, right? Like there's a local identity that really matters. People have a sense that like being in New York is a thing that ties them together. Whereas even though Pomona is drawing people, from an international community in a different way, people have a sense of being in this small place. And I really do think that that's important, that people have a kind of sense of local, some kind of definable sense of identity that's different from some kind of vague sense of national identity, which is so hard for people to access and feel identified with in ways that I talked about before.
I guess I would add, what you want, an ideal world would be something that combined the virtues of both systems. In that sense, I was moved by, and recalling my own college experience, of that face-to-face dimension, you know, the dorms and so on at a small liberal arts college that obviously at a big urban public university you don't get. It's much more anonymous, which also has its benefits. So you want some combination of this, the face-to-face thing, because that agreeing to disagree in a face-to-face way is really important. You're going to see some of these students in another class in the future if you're having, you know, a difficult conversation, whereas at a big public university, it may well be the case that you never see the student you disagreed with again. So how to combine them is, you could say, another big challenge or trick.
Shall I wait for the
Yeah,
microphone,
I'm
or
supposed,
shall I
I'm,
just-
I think I'm supposed to let.
or shall I just declaim? Those are so exciting. Really appreciate those unbelievable mini lectures. They're really stimulating. I wanted to ask you whether, just invite any of you to comment on whether you think that there's this kind of Tocquevillian idea about the parties in America might be useful to students at both small liberal arts colleges and public universities. You know, there's this Aristotelian idea that when Aristotle writes about democracy, there's a party of equality and there's a party of distinction. And they both kind of exaggerate their claims, and they both even kind of misunderstand their claims. Like the party of distinction confuses money and wealth with virtue. And so what we really want is a good mixture of these two. That would be the best approximation of justice that we could get. And the best mixture is a mixture that doesn't even know it's a mixture. It doesn't know it's mixing these things. And then when Tocqueville looks at Jacksonian parties, at the mixture of, you know, Jacksonian democracy, he says these parties are so indistinguishable you can barely, you know, you can't really tell what's going on in them at all. They're disagreeing on these tiny little puny points of detail. It's like you don't know whether to feel bad for these people or to celebrate this accomplishment that they can have a contestatory politics about nothing. But he says, you know, if you study the secret souls of the parties and you trace them, as it were, I don't know, you know, to their roots, you'll see that what fuels them in each case is one of the passions that's always fueled democratic conflict. You know, aristocratic passions on one side and democratic passions on the other, or a passion for equality and a passion for distinction. And I wonder if this kind of scheme might, if you think it might help students understand, you know, something about how to be healthy as a polity and as a person, that we have these passions. We want to distinguish, but we also don't want to be snobs, you know, and revile other people for, you know, and create false divisions. But we do want to, you know, make a name for ourselves somehow. And so we have to combine these things and be motivated by each in a way that's healthy, and ideally too in our regime, which characteristically combines them through equality of opportunity. Everyone has an equal way of distinguishing them, an equal chance to distinguish or be unequal. It's an interesting combo. But anyway, would you welcome this Tocquevillian insight and as a way of understanding something about our parties, our politics, and our souls?
Yeah, I could say something about that. Thank you. Am I on? People hear me? So yeah, I think when, you know, Tocqueville was visiting the United States, he was touring around the same time that Martin Van Buren was trying to create these national party conventions and these large coalitional parties. And Van Buren was, you know, very conscious of what he was trying to do. He wrote that he was trying to create a party that would join together the plain men of the North and the planters of the South. And I think he recognized that what he was doing was coalition building, that those two groups didn't have to go together in a political party. You could imagine a party that had a different coalition of different groups. But he says, let's find some principles that we can agree on that will join together this broad coalition. I think the health of the Van Buren system was that each party saw themselves as heterogeneous and diverse coalitions of many different individuals, groups, and associations. And of course, he did that in an attempt to stave off civil war, in an attempt to prevent sectionalism or regionalism from becoming so hardened in the United States. So I think it's that kind of approach can provide for a healthy pluralist kind of parties. So in my own research, I know some people say, oh, you're against the two-party system. And so actually, I think there's a lot of good in the two-party system. But I think two parties that recognize themselves as pluralist parties rather than monist parties will be healthier for our politics.
Can I just pick up on an element, I don't mean to presuppose, but there's an element to that that links to a question I had about Verlan's framework, which is that
You want the microphone?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
You gotta turn it on.
It's on.
There we go. It seemed to me that in Verlan's framework, intellectual humility, and as you've just outlined, the development of partisanship, political beliefs would always be a second-order belief, and then we would then be reflecting back onto something that's primary in a healthy framework as Verlan presents it. And so I wonder to some extent how that worked, and then also how we would achieve it. And this would go to, I think, some of what Sue and Dan was raising about sort of civic education would be an education on top of something. And I don't know if that seems fair to you to say that we'd have to learn to see our political beliefs as always second order in order to do the kind of healthy work of partisanship that you had.
And so the category, the sort of candidates for the things that it's built on top are things like attachment to the community as a whole and deliberative values and things like that. And then on top of that, you have your own views. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but it could, I think
Yeah.
part of the concern, and I think this came out in both Sue and Dan's remarks, is it could be many things, not all of which are necessarily we would consider healthy from an educative point of view. What
Right.
people's primary attachment
So you have to make a list of the
Yeah.
things that you actually think should be adjacent to the partisanship. But and then one has to be accountable for what those things are and explaining whether because they could also be hyper nationalism or something as the thing that's built underneath it. But I also wanted to I'm interested in the question about Tocqueville. The style of analysis that Tocqueville is using there is one in which you look at the messy reality and you try to find the underlying intellectual trait. So that the rival to that is to understand parties as interest coalitions, and there's probably some truth in both. I think if you push the methodology of looking for the intellectual underpinnings of the parties too far, you both falsify the reality of the messiness, but also you tend then to potentially polarize around that distinction, right? The other just note is that our interest coalitions have shifted, right? I mean, the big one being the so-called diploma gap, the shift of highly educated people to the Democrats and less educated people to Republicans, which is a global, not universal, but widespread global phenomenon. And that changes the nature of the party competition. It changes the Tocquevillian framework because it means that the interests align quite differently. And actually troubles me a lot because I worry that the center-left party having an upscale coalition is going to block any significant reform, economic reform, and the center-right coalition being based more in working class, not only in the United States but also in Europe, is not going to be able to offer things like tax cuts because a lot of its base is not paying income tax. It's going to offer some kind of ethno-nationalism, and so that would be the path that we would be on.
I can't resist the chance to talk about Tocqueville ever. And one of his observations that I think ties a lot of this together is about the connection between what he calls the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty. And Tocqueville says that especially the Puritans could tolerate all sorts of messiness in their political categories in life because they had a sense of fixed moral order in their religious lives. And one of the things that I think we have to notice if we want to take seriously what we call political polarization, that it has happened at exactly the same time that what we call the Great De-Churching has happened. That is that there's been a decline in religious membership across religions in the United States. I think a better way to understand what we call political polarization is as political sectarianism, that people, absent the sense of a fixed moral order, are more intent on having that kind of like fixed moral order attached to their politics. And so the debates we see between Republicans and Democrats more resemble debates between Sunni and Shia Muslims than they do like older debates between rival political factions. That's something that I think is a big challenge in the background for civics programs, because obviously you can't, legislate that people discover religious identities, right? Especially if more and more of our students grow up with no kind of sense of religious background. But that is in the background of what's happening in American politics.
I might, if I can, just I want to wholeheartedly agree with what Susan said. I think the political polarization label is a little bit misleading. Sectarianism is probably a better label or vocabulary to describe what's going on. Now, as Peter said, there is something real that we could call affective polarization, although, again, I don't know if polarization is the right word for it, which is this increasing dislike between the two political parties, increasing hostility. But that word polarization tends to imply something about ideological polarization, which I think is a much more problematic concept. I mean, we've all lived through this, right? Just in the last, say, 10, 15 years, we have a president right now who everyone considers far right or a right-wing extremist or extremely conservative. And, you know, what was it, 13 years ago, the Republican Party nominated a candidate who people called center-right or moderate. So according to the left-right ideological polarization framework, that would say, okay, so Donald Trump just took all of Mitt Romney's positions to the extreme. So if Mitt Romney was moderately in favor of free trade, therefore Donald Trump must be extremely in favor of free trade. Well, no, right? Mitt Romney was moderately in favor of foreign interventionism abroad, so Donald Trump is extremely foreign interventionist. Well, no, it's the opposite. Mitt Romney was moderately in favor of, you know, traditional Christian morality, so Donald Trump is the extreme apotheosis of Christian morality. Right? This doesn't make sense to think in terms of ideological polarization, but it is affective polarization, and it is political sectarianism. I think that's a better language and vocabulary.
I know that Tom. Yeah, how about you? Sorry. I think I'm supposed to keep this one. Apologize.
Well, thank you very much. Is it on?
You gotta turn it off. Turn it off.
Pardon me? Is it on? I'll tell you what, honestly, I don't think I need it. I am intrigued by the comment about the 50% of students aren't aware of their family backgrounds and their parental backgrounds, political preferences, and whether you regard that as sad in a lack of awareness or engagement in the family, or two, whether that's a real opportunity for institutions, and whether other institutions around the state have experienced the same kind of lack of familiarity going into becoming a student. We did a survey on our campus and found that between entering college and leaving, or being in the middle of their education experience, the political ideology changed by 0.5%. So we did a really bad job of indoctrinating students during that time. And that is kind of the catchphrase in Ohio and in other states around the country. So I'm intrigued, number one, to hear from some others throughout the conference if that's the same experience, and really does it sadly say something about the lack of engagement of our students, or is it an opportunity for us to help be part of critical thinking and developing good civics education, or is it both? And so maybe a quick response, and I know one of you I'll be talking with in the future with your experience in your new state. Any responses to that series of questions?
Well, I would say first, I guess I see it maybe when I was younger and, you know, more idealistic. I would have been, this is really sad. The students don't, you know, have a partisan party ID and they're not interested in public affairs. Now I guess I see it more as an opportunity, right? I see that it's just they're not in a political sect yet, and once somebody's in a political sect, it's hard to get them out. And as Sue was describing, once you have these sets of categories and you can label other people and put them in these boxes, it acts as a real constraint on thinking. So, on the other hand, I also agree that if we did the same survey as you did, freshmen to when the students graduate, I would imagine they haven't moved that much, but I guess I would see that as too short a time. Really, what are we teaching for at the university level? It's not so much that things are going to change dramatically over 4 years. You're really teaching for the long term, which is that sometime in their future life, even if it's not conscious, some part snaps awake of what they learned in this class, or some argument that they heard from Professor Lewis about how, like, these categories didn't make any sense, you know, is jogged in their mind when they're having a discussion or a debate. So we're really teaching for the long term in that way, and we don't need I think it would be a mistake to just try to focus on this some short-term outcome of freshman to senior year or something like that. I guess that would be where my starting place on those 2 points.
Microphone, so I guess it's my turn to speak. Thank you, all four of you. Very thought-provoking talks. And my question, I suppose, could be addressed by any of you, maybe Verlan the most. I was really taken in by what you said about civic virtue as something that is both particularly our republic and all Republican governments depend on and has an interest to promote, and particularly as a way of overcoming an entrenched partisanship. But it seems to me that at least in the last 15 to 20 years, even to speak of civic virtue is already to identify oneself as a certain kind of partisan. And I wonder if that's something that you agree is a problem, and how it might be overcome. I suppose I'm also thinking of Aristotle, not so much his political or moral writings, but even just his logical writings, that for any meaningful debate to occur, there must be a shared premise or set of premises, and what those premises might be for us in 2025.
Yeah, okay, I'm happy to address that one. I think it's a really good question, and I think it speaks to the importance of pluralism or a pluralist viewpoint rather than a monist viewpoint, because I think civic virtue is one of many important principles or ideas or practices that we need in a republic. And I think the danger of a unidimensional spectrum is you say, okay, civic virtue is on the spectrum somewhere. It's either left wing or right wing. Well, once you've made that determination, then you've cut yourself off from half of the population that identifies with the other side of the political spectrum. So just anecdotally, I was having a conversation maybe 4 weeks ago with a friend who's an economist, and he was complaining to me about some of the actions by the new administration, the Trump administration. And I was sympathetic to some of his concerns and complaints. And he says, I really like what you're doing, with your work about trying to promote civic virtue. And he says, I think we need more of that. And then he said, even though I'm a liberal, I think we need to get back to civic virtue. And I thought that was really telling that he prefaced it with, even though I am. Because he was thinking in terms of a left-right spectrum, right? There's conservatives and liberals. And he thinks, I'm a liberal, and therefore I can't be in favor of civic virtue, but I kind of want to be. And I think if we get rid of the left-right thinking and realize that there's a plurality of values and principles, civic virtue should be a part of both of our major political parties and independents. I think it's something that we need for everyone and not just one side of a political spectrum.
Good morning. I want to come back to the whole liberal arts versus big public university debate. And it was telling that this kind of came right on the heels of Peter's comment that perhaps our efforts might be misplaced, or at least maybe the effort we see coming in this kind of 18 to 22-year-old range of the classic liberal arts colleges, and a little bit more so, but generally in the large public universities. Maybe we're heading off some worrisome political affective polarization going on. But to Peter's comment about the older generations where we're seeing this more pronounced, I'm wondering what civic centers and civic education at the university level looks like if we're trying to attend to that population who's not maybe immediately on our campuses in our efforts.
I mean, I was trying to plant the idea that the deficits are not particularly among young people, and so we need to think, if we want to solve the problem, we need to think more than, there is of course a long-term play where as you just said, the young people are, 40 years later something might go off for them, but there are immediate problems with older people. We also have I like to tell quickly the story that in 1945, immediately after World War II, some of the same people were charged with two tasks by President Truman. One was to figure out how to do democratic education in occupied Germany, and the other was how to strengthen American higher education. And so some of the same people wrote the Truman Report in the United States and the sort of framework for German education. And basically in Germany, they said, well, all the people are Nazis, so they need to be re-educated, and that includes the adults. So they created the basis of an adult education system, which is pretty robust today. Voluntary, but well supported. You can be an adult educator in Germany, and that includes adult democratic education, and you can study that and learn it, and there's lots of programs. In the United States, what they did was basically to recommend the community college system and then the expansion of the four-year system, and didn't touch the curriculum. And the idea there was that Americans were doing fine, but they needed to go to college to be more effective. And I think so within one of the consequences of that all these years later is that we, to a large extent, expect especially our public colleges and universities to be the centers for public debate in the community. They're the people who invite the speaker or have the public forum, which is great in some ways and also a bit odd because it's not right on their mission and it's sort of a secondary thing. And whereas the same function in Germany would be played by these community-based organizations with federal and state funding. So we made a policy choice there that basically committed us to not messing with the beliefs of older people. And I don't know if we can keep doing that.
Thank you. These were wonderful talks. I appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into them. One of the points where there seemed to be a divergence was that one suggestion was that civic education is liberal education. Actually, it points to the formation of character. And if we don't begin with that, then civic education is not going to be satisfying or successful. But another good point was that, well, we have to educate a lot of students, especially at public institutions. So character formation, especially the type of education, the Socratic education that Susan pointed to, is not really going to be possible. So I'm wondering, to what extent is this division something we are going to have to formulate two separate approaches to education, or should civic education in general be about the distinction between liberal education and citizenship?
I don't know, unless one of you want to jump in. I guess I would say, I think the movement of creating these civic schools, what is the kind of general thrust? It's partly to create, you could say, especially at large research institutions here like Ohio State, is to create a kind of liberal arts college inside a Research One university. And that's the model in Texas, in North Carolina, in Florida. And the benefits could be twofold, which is it gives another path for students who might have liked to go to Pomona. I'm not sure what tuition with room and board is at Pomona these days. I'm imagining it's approaching $100,000 a year. But they might have liked to have gone to Pomona, but they couldn't afford it, so they're at their state university. But now they can have a liberal arts college experience, and that really suits that student. So that would be one potential upside of these civic schools. The other is that insofar as that is instantiated inside the large research university, it has a leaching out effect of changing the tone or character. Even students who aren't, let's say, majoring in that school, but are roped in by one of their friends to go to a vigorous public debate with different perspectives, and they just hear about it that, hey, look, real public debate is happening in these places. That changes the broader tone, perhaps widens the ambit of what faculty members feel like they can even say to each other, at the faculty dining hall, right? Which was before, well, I couldn't say this quite positive thing about capitalism, even though I really believed it. But now I can because it's partly changed the tone. So that would be at least two ways that, it's a problem, you're right, but, these might help on those dimensions.
Real quick, I just wanted to encourage, I do some work on empirical democratic theory and have, to my surprise really, actually uncovered a lot of evidence that party and affective polarization, and to some extent ideological polarization, is much more contextual and fragile than we suppose. People treat it as a trait. It is much more of a state. Meaning it's very easy to get people to take one hat off, their partisan warrior hat off, and put their American citizen hat on. I think creating environments and opportunities for people to practice inhabiting that identity, those different identities, is just as important as trying to break down or re-educate or push back against it. It's to create meaningful opportunities where people see those identities as the salient ones for their political interactions.
Since we're right at 10, or right about at 10, I will break, but I will say one goal of having the roundtable format follow the panels is that we can bring back topics that we didn't get a chance to fully address right now. And so that's part of my hope, is that questions that people didn't get a chance to raise, that they might be able to get back to those topics on the roundtables that follow in 15 minutes at 10:15. Thanks very much to the panelists.